debunk is the right word. I just want to challenge us to think things through. Back in September of this year, there was a pretty well-known blogger who posted an article entitled, "Adolescence, a Modern Plague, but There is a Cure." And he said, back in the old days, there were two types of people in the world. There were children and there were adults. You were a child and then you became an adult. And the timeline of life went something like this. Phase 1, birth and childhood. Phase 2, adulthood. Phase 3, death. He also said this about adolescence. It's a state-of-the-art modern innovation like crack cocaine and chemical warfare. So his style was obviously very sarcastic, but I think his intent was serious. And I think he put into words what a lot of people think and feel, which is that adolescence is this new, scary, dreadful thing, and if we could just somehow dismantle it, then we could usher or maybe shove our adolescence straight into adulthood and return to some kind of mythical utopia that used to exist at some point. And that myth, and I do think it's somewhat of a myth that we go from childhood straight into adulthood, has really become established fact. A lot of you have probably heard it. It shows up in textbooks and academic journals and popular books, and it goes something like this. Phase 1, 150 years ago, there were a lot of changes in the world: industrial revolution, urbanization, expanded public education. Adolescence was born. Phase 2, in about 1904, a guy named G. Stanley Hall wrote this gigantic 2-volume book called Adolescence. Its psychology and its relations to physiology, anthropology, sociology, sex, crime, religion, and education. And the scientific study of adolescence was officially born. Phase 3, great big problems, what we might call wicked problems, started. But I think the historical evidence shows something really different. And I think historical evidence can be important for a few reasons. Mostly because the premise of our theories lead to what we do with them. And if we've got accurate foundations, I think there's a different way about how we can have wise applications. Also because this child to adult idea that goes around has left a lot of adults with a lot of anxiety and worry and fears about this monster that's devouring their children. So I'm going to give you this historical mashup, kind of 12 centuries in 12 minutes, and just see if it prompts any ideas about what it might mean for us today. So we're going to look at the thinkers first. These are the data and the numbers people, the astronomers, the philosophers, the mathematicians, who love to identify, define, and systematize things, including the ages of man. So there were all kinds of theories about the different stages of life. They all had something to do with nature. They all paralleled nature in some way, whether it was the seasons, the months, the elements, the humors, the planets. And they did that because they assumed that all the stages of life were natural. They were part of our DNA, part of our neurology, even before we knew about DNA and what brains do. So you can go all the way back to Aristotle, who said that adolescents have strong passions, they have fickle desires. I love bacon, I hate bacon, I love bacon, I hate bacon. They can't decide. They're moody, they have hot tempers, they've got hopeful dispositions. They are very hesitant to accept the rules of society. Sound familiar? They kind of became a prototype in some ways, not just a stereotype, I think. Then there were the astronomers, who said that Venus was the planet that influenced youth. This is shocking. Venus is the planet of love. This is what they said about Venus. She implants an impulse towards the embrace of life. A kind of frenzy enters the soul. There's desire for any chance sexual gratification. There's burning passion. There's the blindness of an impetuous lover. In the 10th century, a monk named Beert Ferth made this early medieval infographic that takes all of the different fours and he organizes them. So the 4 humors, the 4 seasons, all the elements, the months, and the 4 ages. And the top right, we'll look at that one. This one is adolescence. There was childhood, adolescence, manhood, and old age. Adolescence goes with fire, heat, the month of May when it's virility and new life. That's who adolescents are. Then there was this great compendium of knowledge. It was the first one that was alphabetized and systematized by topics. There is a full-page entry for adolescence, a full page, plus another column on the next page. If you look at that historiated initial, that really cool initial, you see there adolescence in all its glory. Vanity, that mirror was an icon for adolescence in images. Flirtation, do you see what she's doing with her skirt, hitching it up? Virility, that sword, if you would just look at the design of the sword. One thing I hated about my studies was that everybody was always trying to look for some hidden meaning. But the design of that sword and where it's hanging is a really clear indication to me that he is not headed into a traditional battlefield. Emotions, and the emotions in this one are with the male. Where his hands are on his heart and his stomach, it was a sign of emotional love sickness. That's what it was. And fashion, the hair, beardlessness showed that it was an adolescent male. The tight hose, the short tunic, those are all things. Actually, I would like to prefer to call those medieval jeggings and toms, because that's what it looks like he's wearing. So there were all kinds of fears, but I think there was envy because we're looking, or the adults who are looking at this are going, they're beautiful, they're young, they're strong, they get to have sex all the time. I don't know what they're thinking, but I know there's envy also, not just fears. Even the dictionaries going all the way back to the 15th century all have entries for adolescence. Even the dictionaries that said they only included the important words that people really needed to know. The only difference between all of these theories about adolescence was when adolescence ended. Some said 21, some said 22, some said 24, some said 28, which means that prolonged adolescence is not a new thing either. Then there's the creators, the poets, the storytellers, the painters, the playwrights. Horace said that if you want to have a good play, your characters have to be believable, and that means that your young adolescent characters need to behave the way that young adolescent people behave. Dante, who was probably the greatest poet ever, said that you have to make your adolescents, they last up until 25. Because until then, the soul is concerned with all the changes that are going on, and because the rational part of the soul isn't discerning yet as well as it should be. Chaucer's tales all star adolescence, and they're either supernaturally awesome, kind of like Katniss Everdeen or some saint, or they are really delinquently and disgusting comical, like Animal House or American Pie for the medieval era. Shakespeare talks about the boiled brains of 22-year-olds. William Cowper talks about the vigorous and the headlong rage of adolescence. An epigram says, this is from the 1800s, happy follies and prudent intemperance make up the charms of adolescence, because they're foolish and yet they're having so much fun. One painter drew this illustration of the 7 ages of man. So, do you see the tight hose and the short tunic? Yeah, that's the adolescent right there. He's pulled away from childhood and boyhood. I know those two little guys look old, but the size is what tells us it's childhood and boyhood. He's separated from them, but he's got his back to all the adults. He's not part of either world. He's hanging out there in the middle, and it's true that he's got center stage, but he's alone. Usually they didn't get center stage like that, and they didn't get very much space. Most of the time, adolescents were pushed to the margin of illustrations, where they could be contained and controlled, maybe. They're all over. And when we see them doing typical adolescent things. We can pull those up. They are showing off, they're courting, they're studying, they're goofing off, they're competing, they're shopping, they're hanging out with their friends. They're always with peer groups, they're almost never with adults, and they are always engaging in stereotypical behavior. And then there's the preachers. You might be surprised to know that preachers have had some pretty strong views about adolescence going way back when. They were worried because adolescents could recite entire ballads about Robin Hood, but they couldn't recite the creed. How were they going to stick to church? Pastors, preachers were worried about adolescents who stay up late, carousing, drinking until their brains were disturbled, that was the word, and then they would sleep the next day and get nothing done. They were worried about dancing and music and gambling and lust and pride. And at first glance, it all sounds terribly depressing and really negative. But if you read them really, really carefully, there is this lovely little thread of hope and encouragement that runs throughout all of those homilies. There's this belief that adolescents had more understanding and more character and more self-control than a lot of people thought. There was a conviction that they could do and accomplish more than many people thought. And there was also this really clear understanding that now, this age, is the time when your faith can become personal and vibrant and rooted and lasting. They saw the possibilities in adolescence. So really, adult views of adolescence have not changed very much over time. There were fears, there's been worries, there's been envy. Certainly, adolescent experience has changed over time. I mean, in the Viking era, 12, 13, 14-year-old boys could fight alongside the grown men, but when it came time to pay the blood money, they weren't worth as much. And in the Middle Ages and the Renaissance, and a little later, they could become apprentices at age 14 and leave home, and they worked by adults, but they had curfews. They couldn't get married until they finished their apprenticeships, was in their 20s is when they finished, and they couldn't engage in any business on their own until the guild masters said they could when they were in their 20s. So to the blogger, this is what I would say. Adolescence is not modern. It's not a plague. We don't need to cure it. We don't need to cure them. We don't need to dismantle adolescence into some mythical past era. This is what I think we need to do. It looks something like this. Phase 1. We need to know adolescence more than we know about adolescence. We need to hear them and understand them, and so we can speak into their identity formation. Phase 2. See and hear them, especially the ones who are in the margins. Even better yet, maybe we could be their backup guitar players. Let them take center stage for a while. And we need to share life with them joyfully, especially when they are doubting and when they are going through their dark nights of the soul, which they will, because I think we can model for them what it means to be suffering, yet always rejoicing, doubting, yet always abiding. Adolescents themselves are not state-of-the-art modern innovations. They have always been created in the image of God. And part of God's character is woven into every single stage of life, including adolescence. And so if we do not pay careful attention to our young friends, if we do not hear, see, and know them, we are going to miss out on seeing and knowing God in all of his fullness. Amen.